I am going to be talking about the fictional serial killer Dexter Morgan. He's from the Showtime television show called Dexter. I am going to be using Sigmund Freud's theory of psychoanalysis to help explain Dexter's personality developments and his behavior. And specifically from Freud's psychoanalysis, I'm going to be using constructs such as destructive instinct, drive reduction. I'll be talking about Dexter Morgan's id-ego conflicts. I'll also be speaking about how I believe Dexter engages in defense mechanisms, namely sublimation, rationalization, and repression. And lastly, I'll touch on Dexter's psychopathy and neuroticism and why, potentially, according to Freud's definition of psychopathology, Dexter may not necessarily meet the criteria of it. So now I'd like to give a brief history of Freudian psychoanalysis. It was first developed by, of course, German physician Sigmund Freud in Germany in the 1800s. When Sigmund Freud was very young, he had a lot of resentment towards his own father. And so I believe that I believe that helped to inform his very pessimistic view of human behavior. And as he grew up and developed psychoanalysis, he came to believe that humans acted in accordance with satisfying urges, specifically the urges to have sex and release aggression. So those two kind of define psychoanalysis. He also developed a theory of personality, and what he said was personality was divided into three main parts: the id, which he believed to be mainly unconscious. The id represents primitive urges like sex and aggression. He also said that personality was divided into ego, and ego is essentially a way of taking id urges and releasing them into socially acceptable behaviors, kind of a check on the id. And the last personality trait, the last personality development was the superego, which it kind of represents the moral aspect of human nature. He believed that human beings were unique in the sense that we were the only species to rationalize immoral behavior and understand why it may be immoral. Freud also talked about how the id may feel threatened. People may feel that the id wants to release these socially unacceptable behaviors. And so, excuse me. And so the way that they combat releasing the behaviors is through defense mechanisms. And the id kind of elicits feelings of anxiety. And using those defense mechanisms are ways to alleviate the anxiety and relieve it. Lastly, Freud spoke about personality development in regards to different stages. He said that personality developed as a child when you were very young, and it developed through a number of stages that he deemed psychosexual stages. And it started at, age 0 and went all the way up until puberty. Some of these stages include the oral stage, the anal stage, and the phallic stage. Now I'd like to look at Freudian psychoanalysis in regards to the character I've chosen, Dexter Morgan. Dexter lacks sexual libido, and what I mean by that is he uses his libido, his psychic energy libido, more so in his aggression than in sex. He kind of, in a lot of ways, lacks a sex drive, but, according to Freud, libido can be defined as sexual or aggressive. And the libido is mostly focused in his drive instinct to release his aggression. I'll also be talking about Dexter engaging in a number of defense mechanisms, like I said before, and that Dexter being a serial killer, he does have philosophical and moral arguments in his mind. So his ego and his superego do conflict at times. Now I'd like to briefly touch on the character of Dexter Morgan and give a little background of him. He is 33 years old. He lives in Miami, Florida. He works for the forensics department for the Miami Metro Police Department. And like I said before, he is a serial killer. So by day, he'll work his job for the police department, and at night, he will go out and find people to kill. Now, unlike many other real serial killers, Dexter has some kind of moral code. When he was young, he had a father figure that helped him develop a code. And by that, I mean Dexter only kills other killers or criminals. Now, I'd like to touch on his personality traits. Dexter lacks remorse and is emotionally and lacks also emotional empathy, but he does possess some cognitive empathy. There are points in the show where we see that Dexter can understand cognitively why somebody may feel a way like sad or joy, but he can't reciprocate those emotions. He can only witness them from afar. He can't feel them. He's unemotional, he's cold, he's socially awkward, he's very expressionless throughout the show. He doesn't smile really, he doesn't frown, he just has a blank, cold stare. But despite that, there are points in the show where Dexter displays concern and affection for a few characters, and mainly his sister, his girlfriend, and his girlfriend's children. Additionally, Dexter is a white male. So right now, I would like to look at Dexter's aggression. That's the first piece of the analysis I'd like to look at. So Dexter is very, very much driven by aggression. And according to Freud, this aggression instinct serves what he called the destruction instinct, and essentially it's a way to relieve tensions that accumulate from libido. So Dexter feels an urge to release his aggression in the form of killing, and so he will go out and find people to kill to release that aggression and feel relieved. Now, something I found very interesting about Freudian psychoanalysis was that Freud believed that everyone intuitively has an urge to kill, and he believed that because excuse me, we unconsciously want to return to a state in which we no longer have, which is non-being, according to Freud, and death kind of represents that. Now, unlike other serial killers, Dexter differs in some ways. I'm sorry, unlike other people who sublimate their aggression in healthier ways, Dexter releases his aggression in a very socially unacceptable way, which is murder. And according to Knight in his article on serial killers, aggression is a part of the drive principle and demands continuous release. Serial killers know what's wrong and what's right. They choose to ignore the warnings from the superego and fall victim to the id. Yeah, so there's this kind of notion that serial killers have no sense of right and wrong. They're only acting on impulse and they don't care about the consequences or the moral consequences. But that's, according to Knight, largely untrue. In his study, he found that serial killers mostly understand the consequences of their behavior. They just choose to ignore their ego and superego, according to Freudian analysis, and listen to the id and release their urges. And I have a clip here that demonstrates Dexter's aggression. In this clip, he kills somebody he deemed worthy of killing. Yeah, so in that clip, Dexter is being very aggressive and placing a pillow over somebody's head to kill them. I also like to briefly touch on Dexter's sexual libido. There are very, very few points in the show that Dexter is sexual. Mostly he's avoiding sexual encounters and contact. Most of his, like I said, most of his libido reserve psychic energy is released in the form of aggression, in the form of murder. And that's something else Knight spoke about in his article. Knight said that serial killers' psychic energy, libido may all be concentrated in aggression. He found that some serial killers um, who were not sexual were more aggressive, and libido can kind of be reserved for aggression rather than sexual. Some serial killers may be more sexual than others. So now I'd like to analyze Dexter's id and ego conflict. Like I said, according to Dexter's id, in Freudian analysis, he wants to just release his aggression indiscriminately. He unconsciously, he does not care who he kills. He just wants to release that urge to be aggressive and kill. Um, Early in the show, it is revealed that Dexter was adopted by a man named Harry. And like I spoke about earlier, Harry found out that Dexter had urges to kill. And together they developed a code because Harry ultimately decided that there was no way Dexter wasn't going to kill. He was not going to be able to control these urges. And so Harry and Dexter came up with a plan, a moral code. And basically, the code says only kill other people who have killed or violent criminals that you're sure have killed or are going to commit crimes. You have to be certain. Those are the only people you can kill. And Dexter, again, at a very young age in his teenage years, Dexter developed this moral code. And this kind of represents his superego and ego working together to make sure the id does not take over. Um, Dexter's ego and id mostly don't fight in the early show, but they fight a lot in later seasons, like the end of season 2, when Dexter is confronted with a situation in which he might have to kill an innocent man. One of Dexter's coworkers, a man named Sergeant James Dokes, finds out that Dexter killed somebody and actually encounters him while Dexter is throwing away the body parts. They fight. Dexter subdues Dokes and he traps him in a cage. And now Dexter is kind of faced with a existential crisis, a moral dilemma, because if he doesn't kill an innocent man, Dokes will have Dexter arrested and possibly put to death. But if he does kill Dokes, yes, nobody finds out that Dexter is a killer, but he's now broken his moral code. His superego has now lost to the id because he's killing an innocent man. So I'd like to show this clip right now of when Dexter captured Dokes and has him in the cage and he's speaking about what he's going to do. And he's panicking and he's kind of freaking out. Yes, so in that clip, Dexter is struggling with the idea that he may have to kill an innocent man. He knows releasing that feeling would feel great in the moment, but it would be immoral and bring him feelings of shame and guilt. Now, according to Michaels, um, I'm sorry, let me back up. Dexter was engaging in a state of neurosis, and according to Michael's neurosis, or as he called it in his article, e-neurosis, in a Freudian sense, has many roots, namely ego submission to the id. The ego can become weak and elicit id impulses, potentially leading to immoral and destructive behavior. And that's exactly what we saw in that clip. The ego was kind of arguing with the id and may potentially submit to the id and kill somebody indiscriminately, leading to neurotic symptoms that Dexter was experiencing, panicking, freaking out, sweating. Okay, next I'd like to talk about the defense mechanisms that Dexter engages in. He uses many throughout the show. The first one I'd like to speak about is repression. His mother dies at a very young age, Dexter, like I said before, and he doesn't remember any details about his mother at all whatsoever. Not that she was alive, what she looked like, until he is 33 in the show. In the first season, he finally is able to remember it when he's given certain clues, and he remembers all the details about his mother's gruesome death. The second defense mechanism is sublimation. He channels his urges to kill people by killing people he deems as bad criminals, and that's his way of healthily releasing the urge to kill. And the last defense mechanism Dexter engages in is rationalization. He convinces himself that it's sometimes a good thing that he's killing bad people. He kind of convinces himself that these people were going to potentially do bad things anyway, so it's better that I kill them than they get arrested and maybe potentially get released. And I have three clips here that exemplify each of the defense mechanisms. Killing a bad person, someone he deems as a pedophile. This is him remembering the death of his mother. In that last clip, he is rationalizing killing, about to kill somebody he deemed to be a threat, despite this person never having killed anybody. He just rationalized the murder he was about to commit. Lastly, in my analysis, I'd like to speak about Dexter's psychopathology. Again, at age 3, Dexter witnessed his mother's gruesome death, and these early traumatic experiences have been known to be linked to abnormal behavior, even psychopathology and criminology. There was a study in which Monica et al. Observed early childhood traumatic experiences and maltreatment, and they were found to be positively correlated with measures of psychopathy, psychopathology. Additionally, the researchers found that incarcerated individuals were far more likely to have suffered abuse, neglect, or trauma as children than the non-offenders. And putting this in a Freudian sense, Freud believed that disruption during psychosexual stages could lead to submission to the id, partially explaining destructive and immoral behaviors. Yeah, so Dexter experienced a very, very traumatic event when he was young, 2 or 3 years old, witnessing the gruesome death of his murder. And this traumatic event, Freud believed, could explain submission to the id later in life, which is exactly what Dexter became as he grew up, a serial killer, someone who submitted to his id and released just aggressive urges, very, very aggressive. And Monica et al. found that those traumatic experiences early in childhood were positively correlated with incarceration rates. And people who are incarcerated are people who murder. Dexter, even though he's not currently incarcerated, he would definitely be found guilty if he were caught. So this is my conclusion. Lastly, I'd like to say, in his own way, Dexter was following his ego. He was trying to find more socially acceptable ways to release his aggression, his urge to kill. He sublimates his desire to kill anybody by only killing those who have caused great harm. Still, he employs rationalization to justify murder at all. He tries to rationalize killing people who are violent as, beneficial to society, mostly as a way to rationalize to himself what he's doing. Dexter's libido lies almost exclusively in his destructive instinct. There really isn't much sexual libido. It's mostly in his desire to be aggressive, his destructive instinct. Freud may conclude that Dexter is not necessarily neurotic, since he believed that all human beings were driven by desires to kill. This I found most interesting because, according to Freud, everybody wants intuitively to be very aggressive and kill. Dexter may be no different from any of us. It's just his methods may differ and may be socially unacceptable. It's just, yeah, Dexter just didn't try to sublimate the desires in the same way that many of us sublimate our aggression. That's where he differs. Lastly, these are my references. Thank you very much, Professor.